The first stone lands on your chest like a blacksmith's hammer. Another follows, cracking a rib with a sound like wet kindling. Through the agony, you see them watching. Your accusers, the grim-faced magistrates, the whole of Salem, Massachusetts, gathered to see an 81-year-old man be pressed to death. They demand a plea. They want you to play their twisted game, to legitimize their madness. You have only 2 words for them, scraped from a throat tight with dust and defiance. More weight. Another stone thuds down, stealing the air from your lungs. You refuse to give them the satisfaction of a trial. You refuse to let them confiscate the land meant for your sons. Let them pile the stones higher. Let them crush the breath, the life, the very bones from your body. You will not break. Your answer, until the very end, will be the same. This was the ultimate act of resistance in the Salem Witch Trials, a man choosing to be crushed by stone rather than yield to the court's hysteria. But it was not the beginning. To understand how a respected if stubborn farmer could be condemned to such a barbaric fate, we must ask the question that haunts Salem to this day. How did a civilized town lose its mind? Imagine a world stripped bare. No joyous celebrations, no vibrant colors, only hard work, harsh discipline, and the constant gnawing fear of God's wrath and the devil's temptations. This was Salem Village, 70 years in the making. A community that had fled what they saw as the corrupt England of their ancestors. The Puritans didn't just seek religious freedom, they sought religious purity. Every aspect of life was governed by strict moral codes. Children were expected to be seen and not heard. Young girls, especially, lived in a world where their voices carried no weight, where their thoughts and desires were considered dangerous distractions from godly pursuits. The silence was deafening, the repression suffocating. But Salem wasn't just battling inner demons. The village was caught in a web of external pressures that would have tested any community. King Philip's War had ravaged the region just 16 years earlier, leaving behind a trail of refugees, traumatized survivors, and economic devastation. The sound of war drums still echoed in the collective memory of the villagers. Then came the famines. Crops failed repeatedly, and the colonists watched their children grow thin while they struggled to make sense of God's apparent displeasure. Disease swept through the settlements like wildfire, taking the young and old alike. Each death was a reminder of their mortality, each illness a potential sign of divine punishment. The thing is, Salem wasn't just one community, it was 2, locked in a bitter rivalry that had been festering for decades. Salem town, down by the harbor, prospered from trade and commerce. The merchants there grew wealthy from their connections to the outside world, their ships bringing in goods and gold. Meanwhile, Salem Village, inland and agricultural, struggled to make ends meet. Picture this: Salem Village farmers, working their fingers to the bone, watching their crops fail while the merchants in Salem town lived in comfortable houses and wore fine clothes. The resentment was palpable. You could feel it in every interaction, hear it in every conversation. The village farmers saw themselves as the true believers, the ones holding fast to Puritan values, while they viewed the town merchants as corrupted by worldly concerns. This wasn't just economic jealousy, it was a fundamental clash of worldviews. The village represented the old ways, the pure Puritan ideal of a farming community united in faith. The town represented change, progress, and connection to the wider world. The tension crackled between them like electricity before a storm. And then there were the political uncertainties. Massachusetts Bay Colony's charter had expired, leaving them in legal limbo. Their governor was in England, trying to negotiate a new charter, but no one knew what the future held. Would they maintain their independence? Would they be forced to accept religious tolerance? The very foundations of their society seemed to be shifting beneath their feet. In this atmosphere of uncertainty and fear, even the smallest unusual event took on sinister significance. A cow died unexpectedly, and neighbors whispered about curses. A child fell ill with strange symptoms, and parents searched for supernatural explanations. The community was primed to see evil everywhere, to find someone to blame for their mounting troubles. The young girls of Salem Village lived in this pressure cooker of repression and fear. They were expected to be perfect little Puritans, but they were still children with natural curiosity and energy. They attended endless sermons about sin and damnation, listened to adult conversations filled with worry and suspicion, and absorbed the community's collective anxiety like sponges. Now here's the kicker. All of this tension, all of this fear and resentment and uncertainty had been building for decades. The village was like a powder keg, packed tight with explosive material, just waiting for the right spark. The economic divisions had created bitter enemies. The religious extremism had convinced everyone that Satan was actively working against them. The external pressures had left them traumatized and desperate for explanations. But that silence, that enforced quiet of young girls in a world that gave them no voice, that was about to be shattered in the most terrifying way imaginable. When those voices finally broke through, when those repressed young women finally spoke, their words would carry the weight of all this accumulated fear and resentment. And in their search for enemies, for someone to blame for all their troubles, the community wouldn't have to look far. This village, steeped in fear and suspicion, was a tinderbox. All it needed was a single spark, and that spark was about to be lit by a book written by a paranoid king, an ocean away. King James I of England wasn't just a ruler. He was a man haunted. He believed Satan himself was out to get him, to unravel everything he stood for. And he put his fears onto paper in a way that would echo through the centuries, reaching across the Atlantic to justify unimaginable cruelty in a small Massachusetts village. Picture this. The year is 1590, and James is still King of Scotland. He's recently married Anne of Denmark, and when she tries to sail to Scotland to join him, her ship is battered by terrible storms. Not once, but twice. Any rational person might chalk this up to bad weather, but James wasn't thinking rationally. He was convinced that witches were deliberately trying to prevent his marriage, to destroy his happiness and his kingdom. The investigation that followed reads like something from a nightmare. James personally interrogated suspected witches, convinced that they had confessed to raising storms specifically to harm him. One woman, Agnes Sampson, was subjected to such intense questioning that she eventually confessed to meeting with the devil himself. She even provided intimate details about James's wedding night, details that convinced the paranoid king that supernatural forces were indeed at work. But here's where it gets truly chilling. James didn't just react to this perceived threat, he systematized it. In 1597, he wrote Daemonology, a detailed treatise on witchcraft that would become one of the most influential works on the subject. This wasn't just some abstract theological discussion. This was a royal manual for identifying, prosecuting, and executing witches. James argued that witchcraft was not only real but represented an existential threat to Christian society. He claimed that witches made pacts with the devil, that they could harm people through supernatural means, and that they had to be rooted out and destroyed. The book provided detailed instructions on how to identify witches, how to interrogate them, and how to obtain confessions. And here's the truly horrifying part. James endorsed the use of extraordinary measures to extract confessions. He argued that because witchcraft was such an extraordinary evil, it required extraordinary methods to combat it. Sleep deprivation, relentless questioning, and other forms of psychological pressure were not just permitted but encouraged. The king himself had overseen such interrogations and believed they were necessary to protect Christian society. The influence of daemonology spread far beyond Scotland. When James became King of England in 1603, his paranoid worldview became royal policy. The book was widely read by magistrates, ministers, and educated men throughout the English-speaking world. It provided intellectual justification for what might otherwise have been seen as cruel persecution. But James wasn't the only one putting these ideas into legal practice. A legal manual called The Country Justice by Michael Dalton became standard reading for provincial magistrates. This book, heavily influenced by James's work, provided practical guidance on how to conduct witch trials, how to evaluate evidence, and how to handle the complex legal questions that arose in such cases. Now, here's what makes this so tragically relevant to Salem. These books didn't stay in England. They crossed the Atlantic with the colonists, sitting on the shelves of ministers and magistrates throughout New England. When the witch trials began in Salem, these weren't just local officials making up procedures as they went along. They were following established protocols, backed by royal authority and legal precedent. The sound of pages turning in candlelit studies, as learned men consulted these authoritative texts, would echo in the screams of the accused decades later. The magistrates in Salem felt justified in their actions because they had the written word of a king and the established legal procedures to guide them. They weren't innovating, they were implementing a system that had been developed and refined over nearly a century. The tragic irony is that James's personal paranoia, his conviction that witches were specifically targeting him, became the foundation for a legal system that would consume innocent people far from his kingdom. His fear of imaginary enemies created real victims across the English-speaking world. And you won't believe what happened next. These ideas, these royal fears committed to paper, found their way into the hands of colonial magistrates, who were desperate for guidance in dealing with supernatural accusations. The books that James wrote in response to Scottish storms would soon justify the deaths of New England farmers and housewives. With royal and theological proof in hand, the stage was set. But these ideas needed fertile ground, and in Salem Village, a divisive minister and a group of restless young girls were about to provide just that. Reverend Samuel Parris, a man of God or a man of ambition. His fire and brimstone sermons were legendary in Salem Village, but so was the dislike many felt for him. Parris wasn't born to be a minister. He'd tried his hand at business in Barbados, failed miserably, and turned to the pulpit as a last resort. And in his own house, something strange was stirring. The winter of 1692 was particularly harsh, and inside the Parris household, two young girls were growing restless. Betty Parris, the minister's 9-year-old daughter, and her 11-year-old cousin Abigail Williams, had been cooped up for months, listening to endless sermons about sin and damnation. They were curious, energetic children, trapped in a world that demanded perfect behavior and silent obedience. So get this, they turned to Tituba, an enslaved woman in the Parris household, for entertainment. Tituba had been brought from Barbados, and she carried with her the folk traditions of the Caribbean, stories and practices that would have seemed exotic and forbidden to Puritan children. The girls convinced her to try a bit of fortune-telling, something called the Venus glass, dropping an egg white into a glass of water to see what shapes formed, hoping to glimpse their future husbands. But the shapes they saw weren't romantic visions. According to the girls, they saw something that terrified them, the shape of a coffin floating in the water. The playful glimpse into the future would unleash a terror they couldn't have predicted. Within days, both girls began exhibiting strange behaviors. They would have fits, contorting their bodies in impossible ways, making strange noises, claiming to see invisible spirits tormenting them. Betty would crawl under furniture and make noises like an animal. Abigail would scream that she was being pinched and bitten by unseen hands. Picture this: Reverend Parris, already insecure about his position in the community, watching his own household become the center of supernatural chaos. He called in the local doctor, who examined the girls and delivered a diagnosis that would change everything. The evil hand is upon them. In other words, witchcraft. But here's where it gets even more chilling. The girls didn't just suffer in silence, they began to name names, and the names they chose were telling. They didn't accuse prominent, well-connected members of the community. They went after the vulnerable, the marginalized, the people who couldn't effectively defend themselves. First, they pointed at Tituba herself. The enslaved woman who had tried to entertain them was now their primary target. Can you imagine her terror? She was already powerless in this society, and now she was being accused of the ultimate crime by the very children she had tried to help. Then came Sarah Good, a homeless beggar who wandered the village asking for food and shelter. Good was exactly the kind of person Puritan society had no patience for: poor, desperate, and difficult. When people refused her requests for help, she would mutter under her breath, words that neighbors now remembered as curses. She was an easy target, someone the community was already uncomfortable with. The third accusation fell on Sarah Osborne, a woman who had scandalized the village by living with a man before marrying him. She rarely attended church, was involved in a bitter property dispute with her stepchildren, and was seen as morally questionable by her neighbors. Like the others, she had few defenders in the community. But the real breakthrough came when the authorities began interrogating Tituba. The enslaved woman found herself in an impossible position: deny the accusations and face the full weight of Puritan justice, or confess and possibly save her own life while condemning others. Under immense pressure, terrified and desperate, she chose confession. And what a confession it was. Tituba spun tales of meeting with the devil, of being forced to serve him, of seeing other witches flying through the night. She described a supernatural conspiracy that went far beyond these three initial accusations. Her words, extracted under enormous pressure, painted a picture of Salem Village under siege by supernatural forces. The thing is, Tituba's confession wasn't just an admission of guilt, it was a roadmap for future accusations. She provided details about how witchcraft operated, how witches could be identified, and how they worked together in service of Satan. Her testimony became the template for everything that followed. Little did anyone know, her words would condemn many more. The first accusations had targeted the weakest members of society, but the fire, once lit, was hungry. And soon, it would be fueled by old grudges and powerful families, threatening to consume the entire village. In a small village, everyone knows your business. Everyone remembers your arguments, your debts, your embarrassing moments. Old grudges fester like infected wounds, and when a new weapon appears, like accusations of witchcraft, those old enemies don't hesitate to use it. The Putnam family and the Porter family had been at odds for 20 years. The witch trials became the perfect opportunity to settle scores. The feud between these two families wasn't just personal, it represented the deeper divisions tearing Salem Village apart. The Putnams were conservative farmers, suspicious of change, devoted to the old Puritan ways. They supported Reverend Parris and his strict interpretation of religious law. The Porters, on the other hand, were more liberal, more connected to Salem town's commercial interests, and increasingly skeptical of Parris's leadership. But here's where it gets really sinister. Thomas Putnam, the family patriarch, saw the witch trials as more than just a spiritual crisis, he saw them as an opportunity. His 12-year-old daughter, Anne Putnam Jr., became one of the most prolific accusers in Salem's history. This child would eventually name 48 people as witches, her testimony sending dozens to prison and many to their deaths. Now, picture this. A 12-year-old girl wielding the power of life and death over adults. Anne Putnam Jr. would point her finger at someone, claim they were tormenting her with invisible spirits, and within days that person would be dragged from their home in chains. The sound of her voice, high and accusing, became one of the most feared sounds in Salem Village. The Putnams weren't just making random accusations, they were strategic, targeting their enemies with surgical precision. Members of the Porter faction found themselves accused of witchcraft with suspicious frequency. Property disputes that had simmered for years suddenly became evidence of supernatural malice. Old business disagreements were reinterpreted as proof of demonic influence. Thomas Putnam himself became deeply involved in the legal proceedings, filing formal complaints against accused witches and pushing for their prosecution. He attended hearings, provided testimony, and worked closely with the magistrates to ensure that accusations were taken seriously. His influence in the community meant that when the Putnams pointed fingers, people listened. And here's the kicker. The timing couldn't have been more perfect for this kind of systematic persecution. Massachusetts Bay Colony was in political limbo. Their charter had expired, their governor was in England trying to negotiate a new one, and the normal legal procedures were suspended. The witch trials began during this power vacuum, when there was no higher authority to question the proceedings or demand evidence. In this legal limbo, the afflicted girl's power only grew. Without established procedures or higher authorities to provide oversight, the local magistrates were making up the rules as they went along, and the rules they created heavily favored the accusers. The girl's testimony was accepted without question. Their theatrical performances in court were treated as evidence, and their claims of invisible torture were considered proof of supernatural attack. The escalation was breathtaking. What had started with 3 marginalized women quickly spread to include dozens of people from all walks of life. The accusations began reaching into prominent families, targeting people who had never been suspected of anything worse than missing church occasionally. Meanwhile, the community was tearing itself apart. Neighbors who had lived peacefully for decades suddenly viewed each other with suspicion. Every argument, every business dispute, every personal slight became potential evidence of witchcraft. The social fabric of Salem Village was unraveling, thread by thread. But the real genius of the Putnam strategy was how they used the girl's accusations to attack their enemies, while appearing to be victims themselves. They weren't making the accusations directly, they were simply supporting poor, tormented children who were being attacked by supernatural forces. This gave them plausible deniability if anyone questioned their motives. The magistrates, overwhelmed by the scope of the accusations and lacking clear guidance from higher authorities, fell back on the established procedures they found in their legal manuals. The books written by King James and other authorities provided a framework for handling witchcraft cases, but that framework was designed to find guilt, not innocence. And with every name that Anne Putnam Jr. uttered, with every theatrical performance in the courtroom, with every formal complaint filed by Thomas Putnam, the web of fear grew tighter. The witch trials had become a weapon, and the Putnams were wielding it with devastating effectiveness. With accusations flying and old scores being settled, Salem was spiraling out of control. But how could these claims, often fantastical and contradictory, possibly stand up in court? The answer lay in a terrifying distortion of justice itself. Imagine standing accused of witchcraft in Salem. You have no lawyer to defend you. Your accusers are writhing on the floor of the courtroom, claiming your invisible spirit is tormenting them right at that very moment. The magistrates are watching this performance and treating it as evidence. This was spectral evidence, and in Salem, it was enough to sign your death warrant. The concept of spectral evidence was diabolical in its simplicity. The accusers claimed that witches could send out their spirits to harm people while their physical bodies remained elsewhere. These spirits were invisible to everyone except the victims, which meant that the accused couldn't disprove the charges. How do you defend yourself against an invisible attack that only your accusers can see? Here's the thing. The magistrates knew this evidence was problematic. Some of the more thoughtful members of the community raised concerns about accepting testimony that couldn't be verified or contradicted. But the pressure to act, to protect the community from supernatural attack, overwhelmed their legal caution. The girls' performances were so convincing, so dramatically compelling, that they swept aside centuries of legal precedent. The accused found themselves trapped in a legal nightmare. They had to defend themselves without legal representation, facing judges who were already convinced of their guilt. The burden of proof was reversed. Instead of the prosecution having to prove guilt, the accused had to prove their innocence. And how do you prove you're not a witch when witchcraft is defined as an invisible supernatural crime? But here's where the system became truly perverse. The magistrates discovered that people who confessed to witchcraft were often spared execution, while those who maintained their innocence were more likely to hang. This created a horrifying incentive structure. To save your life, you had to condemn yourself as a servant of Satan, and often, confession wasn't enough. The authorities demanded that confessors name other witches, forcing them to choose between their own lives and the lives of their neighbors. The first person to be executed under this twisted system was Bridget Bishop, a woman who had been accused of witchcraft before and had always maintained her innocence. Bishop ran a tavern, wore colourful clothes, and was known for her sharp tongue, exactly the kind of person who made the Puritan community uncomfortable. When she stood trial, she refused to confess, insisting that she was innocent of all charges. Picture the scene: Bridget Bishop standing before the magistrates, her accusers writhing and screaming in apparent agony, claiming that her spirit was tormenting them at that very moment. The courtroom was packed with spectators, the air thick with tension and fear. Bishop looked directly at her judges and declared her innocence, but her words carried no weight against the dramatic testimony of her accusers. On June 10th, 1692, Bridget Bishop was hanged on Gallows Hill. She was the first to die, but she wouldn't be the last. Her execution was a point of no return. The community had crossed a line from which there would be no easy retreat. The machinery of death was now in motion, and it would claim many more victims before it was stopped. But perhaps the most chilling moment came from Sarah Good, the homeless beggar who had been among the first accused. As she stood on the scaffold, about to be executed, Reverend Nicholas Noyes told her to confess her guilt. Sarah Good's response would haunt Salem for generations. "I am no more a witch than you are a wizard, and if you take away my life, God will give you blood to drink." The curse sent shivers through the crowd. Here was a woman about to die for a crime she insisted she didn't commit, calling down divine vengeance on her executioner. The sound of her voice, filled with righteous fury and desperation, echoed across the hill as the rope tightened around her neck. The magistrates pressed forward with their grim work, convinced they were protecting the community from supernatural evil. But each execution raised new questions. If these people were truly servants of Satan, why did they maintain their innocence even unto death? If the confessions were true, why did they often contradict each other and include impossible details? The answer to these questions lay in the shadow of a practice that had been endorsed by the highest authority in the land, King James himself. The confessions weren't necessarily born of guilt. They were born of something far more sinister, a system of coercion and terror that had been refined over decades of witch trials. The gallows were busy, but many of those confessions weren't products of genuine remorse. They were born of fear, desperation, and psychological breaking techniques that had been sanctioned by royal authority. Why did so many confess to witchcraft in Salem? Were they all truly servants of Satan, as the magistrates believed? Or was there another, darker reason for these admissions of guilt? King James I, in his Daemonology, had provided an answer that would echo through the centuries. Extraordinary evil requires extraordinary measures, and those measures were brutal beyond imagining. The king's paranoia about witchcraft had led him to develop and endorse interrogation techniques designed to break the human will. James argued that because witches served Satan, they would lie to protect themselves and their supernatural master. Therefore, extraordinary pressure was not just permissible, but necessary to extract the truth. This royal endorsement of coercion became the foundation for witch trials throughout the English-speaking world. Consider the case of Agnes Sampson, a Scottish woman who was personally interrogated by King James himself. Sampson was subjected to relentless questioning, sleep deprivation, and psychological pressure until she confessed to meeting with the devil and raising storms to harm the king's marriage. But here's the chilling part. Her confession included intimate details about James's wedding night, information that could only have come from palace gossip, not supernatural revelation. The interrogation had broken Sampson's will so completely that she would say anything to make the questioning stop. She wove together fragments of overheard conversations, popular superstitions, and desperate lies into a confession that convinced the king of her supernatural guilt. Her words, extracted under such duress, became evidence that witchcraft was real and dangerous. This pattern repeated across Europe and eventually reached the colonies. The techniques were refined and systematized. Sleep deprivation to make subjects confused and vulnerable, relentless questioning to wear down resistance, isolation to increase desperation and fear. The goal wasn't to discover truth, but to produce confessions that confirmed what the authorities already believed. The psychological torment was carefully calibrated to break down the accused without leaving obvious physical evidence. Suspects were forced to walk continuously for days, preventing sleep and causing exhaustion. They were deprived of food and water, weakening their bodies and their resolve. They were subjected to hours of intense questioning by multiple interrogators, creating confusion and disorientation. But perhaps the most heartbreaking example of this system's cruelty came from the Pendle Witch Trials in England, where a 9-year-old girl named Janet Device was coerced into testifying against her own mother. The child, terrified and manipulated by adult authorities, provided testimony that sent her mother to the gallows. The breakdown of the most fundamental human bond, between parent and child, demonstrated the complete moral corruption of the system. The authorities justified these methods by claiming they were fighting Satan himself. They convinced themselves that they were doing God's work, that the temporary suffering of the accused was necessary to protect the community from supernatural evil. This righteousness made them capable of extraordinary cruelty while maintaining their sense of moral superiority. The confessions these methods produced were often contradictory and impossible. Accused witches would describe flying to impossible locations, meeting with people who were already dead, or performing supernatural feats that defied physical laws. But instead of questioning the reliability of testimony obtained through such methods, the authorities interpreted these contradictions as evidence of Satan's deceptive power. The accused found themselves in an impossible situation: maintain innocence and face escalating pressure that could last for weeks or months. Confess and hope for mercy, but risk being forced to name others as accomplices. The psychological torture was designed to make confession seem like the only escape from unbearable suffering. And here's what makes this so relevant to Salem. These techniques weren't secret or unofficial. They were established practice, endorsed by royal authority and legal precedent. The magistrates in Salem weren't innovating when they applied pressure to obtain confessions. They were following procedures that had been developed and refined over decades of witch trials. The tragedy is that many of the confessions in Salem were likely produced through similar coercion. The accused, faced with the choice between maintaining their innocence and enduring increasingly harsh treatment, chose to tell their interrogators what they wanted to hear. They confessed to impossible crimes, named innocent neighbors as accomplices, and provided detailed accounts of supernatural activities that existed only in their desperate imaginations. Her confession, likely a desperate attempt to stop the psychological torment, only sealed her fate and provided a template for future accusations. The system had created its own evidence, confirming its own assumptions through the systematic breaking of human will. This system, built on fear, faulty evidence, and brutal coercion, was a machine for producing witches, and it was against this terrifying machine that one elderly farmer, Giles Corey, would make his final, defiant stand. Giles Corey was 81 years old when the accusations reached him. He'd lived a long, often quarrelsome life in Salem Village, earning a reputation as a contentious but hard-working farmer. He'd made his share of enemies over the years, engaged in property disputes, and wasn't shy about speaking his mind. To his eternal shame, he had even initially been caught up in the hysteria, making accusations against his own neighbors. But when the accusing fingers pointed at him, he faced a choice that would define his legacy. The irony was bitter. Corey had initially supported the witch trials, even testifying against others he suspected of supernatural crimes. But the machine of accusation was hungry, and it eventually turned on him. Perhaps it was his contentious nature that made him a target, or maybe old enemies saw an opportunity for revenge. Either way, Giles Corey found himself standing where so many others had stood, in the dock, facing accusations of witchcraft. But here's where Giles Corey proved he was different from the others. He understood the legal system better than most. He'd been involved in enough property disputes and court cases to know how the law worked. And he realized something crucial. If he didn't enter a plea, he couldn't be tried. If he couldn't be tried, he couldn't be convicted. And if he wasn't convicted, his property couldn't be seized by the government. This wasn't just stubbornness. It was a calculated act of protection and defiance. Under English law, the property of convicted felons was forfeited to the Crown. Corey had worked his entire life to build his estate, and he was determined that it would pass to his heirs, not to the government that was trying to murder him. His silence wasn't just personal defiance. It was a father's love and a man's final act of control over his own destiny. The magistrates were baffled. They'd grown accustomed to accused witches who either confessed or proclaimed their innocence. But Corey simply stood there, silent and unmovable. When they asked him how he pleaded to the charges, he said nothing. When they repeated the question, he remained mute. His silence was more powerful than any words could have been. But the authorities had a response to this unprecedented defiance. They remembered an old, horrific law that had been imported from England, peine forte et dure, pressing to death. This barbaric punishment was designed to force a plea from stubborn defendants by gradually crushing them under increasing weight until they either spoke or died. Giles knew the law. He understood exactly what awaited him. The magistrates made sure he understood the consequences of his silence. They described the process in detail, hoping to break his resolve. But Corey had made his decision. He would not give them the satisfaction of a plea, would not participate in the legal farce that had condemned so many of his neighbors. The pressing began on September 17th, 1692. Corey was stripped and forced to lie on the ground. A wooden board was placed on his chest, and then the stones began to accumulate. Each stone added weight, making it harder to breathe, harder to move, harder to maintain his defiant silence. The community watched in horror and fascination. Some probably expected him to break quickly, to beg for mercy and enter a plea. Others admired his incredible strength and determination. But as the hours passed and the weight increased, it became clear that Giles Corey would not bend. The magistrates grew increasingly frustrated. Their legal system depended on defendants entering pleas, on the machinery of justice moving forward according to established procedures. Corey's silence was throwing a wrench into their entire process. They couldn't try him, couldn't convict him, couldn't execute him in the normal way. But they could crush him slowly and methodically until he either spoke or died. And still Corey remained silent. When the sheriff asked if he was ready to enter a plea, the old man's response became legendary. Instead of begging for mercy or agreeing to participate in the legal proceedings, he looked his tormentors in the eye and said, "More weight." The words sent shockwaves through everyone present. Here was a man being slowly crushed to death, and his response was to ask for more punishment. It was an act of defiance so complete, so absolute, that it transcended the immediate circumstances and became something larger, a statement about human dignity in the face of injustice. The magistrates were faced with a man they could not break. Their frustration grew with each passing hour, and then they remembered their grim duty and continued with their barbaric work. The stones were brought in larger numbers. The sheriff gave the order to increase the pressure. Giles Corey looked them in the eye, unflinching, his resolve unshakable. The first heavy stone was laid upon his chest, then another, and as the weight increased, he would utter the words that would echo through history, more weight. And so we return to that September day in 1692, to the sound of stone against stone and the laboured breathing of an extraordinary man. Giles Corey lay there, the weight of the stones crushing his chest, his ribs straining against the impossible pressure. Each breath was a struggle, each heartbeat an act of defiance against the men who sought to break his will. The crowd had grown as words spread through Salem Village. Some came out of morbid curiosity, others out of respect for the old farmer's incredible courage. The magistrates watched with growing unease as their legal system was exposed for what it truly was, not justice, but sanctioned murder dressed up in legal procedure. Sheriff George Corwin, the man overseeing the pressing, later reported that Corey's tongue had been forced from his mouth by the pressure. Using his walking stick, Corwin pushed it back in, a detail that reveals both the horrific nature of the punishment and the sheriff's determination to continue the process. Even in his final moments, the authorities were determined to extract a plea from the defiant farmer. But Giles Corey had made his choice. With his final breath, as the stones finally claimed his life, he had achieved something remarkable. He had died on his own terms, unbroken and defiant. His property would pass to his heirs, as he had intended. The legal system that had claimed so many lives had failed to claim his dignity. The impact of Corey's death was immediate and profound. The sheer brutality of the pressing, combined with his extraordinary defiance, sent shockwaves through the community. People who had supported the trials began to question what they had become part of. The sound of those stones, the image of an 81-year-old man choosing death over submission, haunted Salem in ways the previous executions had not. Within weeks of Corey's death, the witch trials began to collapse. Governor William Phips returned from England and was horrified by what he found. The colony he had left behind had descended into madness, with over 200 people accused, 20 executed, and the community torn apart by suspicion and fear. He immediately suspended the trials and eventually disbanded the special court that had been conducting them. Reverend Samuel Parris, the man whose household had sparked the entire crisis, found his position in the community untenable. The very people who had once hung on his every word now blamed him for the tragedy that had befallen their village. He was eventually forced to leave Salem, his ministry and his reputation in ruins. The accusers themselves faced a different kind of reckoning. Ann Putnam Jr., who had pointed her finger at 48 people, would later offer a public apology for her role in the trials. In 1706, she stood before the Salem Village congregation and acknowledged that she had been deluded by Satan and asked forgiveness for her false accusations. But her words came too late for the 20 people who had died. In 1711, the Massachusetts General Court reversed the convictions of the accused witches and awarded compensation to their families. It was an official acknowledgement that the trials had been a terrible mistake, that innocent people had died because of faulty evidence and flawed procedures. But no amount of money could restore the lives that had been lost or heal the wounds that had been inflicted on the community. The legacy of the Salem Witch Trials extends far beyond that small Massachusetts village. The trials became a cautionary tale about the dangers of mass hysteria, the importance of due process, and the need for skepticism in the face of extraordinary claims. They remind us that fear and suspicion can turn neighbors into enemies, that authority figures are fallible, and that justice requires more than good intentions. But perhaps the most powerful lesson comes from Giles Corey himself. In his final moments, crushed under the weight of stones and the pressure of an unjust system, he chose dignity over submission, principle over survival. His last words, "more weight," became a symbol of resistance against tyranny in all its forms. The stones that crushed Giles Corey's body could not crush his spirit. His defiance echoes through the centuries, reminding us that even in our darkest moments, we have the power to choose how we respond to injustice. Sometimes the most profound victory is simply refusing to be broken, no matter the cost. In the end, Salem's tragedy teaches us that the price of justice is eternal vigilance, not just against obvious enemies, but against the fear and hysteria that can turn any community against itself. Giles Corey paid the ultimate price to preserve his dignity and protect his family's future. His sacrifice stands as a testament to the power of individual conscience in the face of collective madness, a reminder that sometimes the most important battles are fought not with swords or words, but with the simple, extraordinary act of refusing to surrender one's soul.